They say the truth hurts, it might even burn, and I think that's what happened to Billy Carson recently. Now, if you don't know who Billy Carson is, neither did I until fairly recently. I found out about him because a fellow named Wes Huff was recently on the Joe Rogan program, and part of the reason he got there was he sat down with this fellow named Billy Carson. Now, in this meeting between Wes and Billy, basically what happened is, unfortunately, Billy got quite embarrassed, and I think it's because he came into contact with some truth that he had insulated himself from up until that point. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole video. There's lots of people that have shared lots of things about it, but just to give you a little bit of context, Billy Carson, as I understand him anyway, he's one of these people who, you might call him like a biblical conspiracy theorist, something like that. Now, I don't fault anyone who wants to entertain quote-unquote conspiracy theories. I think in our current political moment, there has been lots of so-called conspiracy theories that have turned out to have at least some validity to them. But just to give you a flavor, Billy, is someone who kind of looks at some of the mysteries behind the Bible. The best way I can describe it, if you go to the grocery store sometimes, or frequently actually, I notice that there's often magazines, Time magazine, and they have these sort of headlines about like, did Jesus have a wife, or does Jesus have a half brother, or the 7 secrets that the church doesn't want you to find out about. Sort of this intrigue and mystery about ancient texts. Now, as I understand the story, both Billy and Wes have this common friend, or they did anyway, a fellow named Mark. And somehow Wes was invited to talk to Billy. And it didn't go well for Billy, unfortunately. I don't know him. I've never heard of him until recently. I have no ill will toward him. But I think this demonstrates the problem we can all have when we choose to disconnect ourselves or insulate ourselves from the truth. I think the same thing kind of happened with that Australian breakdancer. I think she goes by the name Raygun, where she insulated herself from feedback, from criticism, presumably, I don't know the whole story with her, until she got to the Paris Olympics, and it was embarrassing for her when what she thought was maybe good breakdancing, and you know what, in fairness to her, she's a better breakdancer than I am, that's for sure, but certainly she shouldn't be at the Olympics. And there's a pattern here that I've noticed, and I've noticed it with the wildfires in California as well. Now, I don't know exactly what's happening there, but I think there's a good analogy with forests that collect deadwood, and if there's not fires that are allowed to ignite from time to time, you get this collection of deadwood that builds up and builds up and builds up, and sooner or later that deadwood is going to get exposed to a spark, a flame, and with all that deadwood, you're going to have a raging fire. And I think in a similar way, a lot of us, we want to try to insulate ourselves from the truth, from things that seem kind of harsh. And kind of like, that deadwood, when we disconnect ourselves from truth, we become dried and withered and susceptible to burning. This also, I think, happens with political ideologies. There's lots in the world that we would rather not be the way that they are. And instead of dealing with the truth of the way things are, we can have this tendency to want to separate and to maybe build our own story as to what's really going on, in an effort to protect ourselves and maybe to protect others from that truth. Now, what is truth? That's a good question, of course, and there's different philosophical answers. One that I like, that I think is fairly neutral, is truth is a statement that corresponds to reality, or truth is a manifestation or something that is resonant or in accord with reality. And when we try to protect ourselves from truth, we can sometimes, because truth, to be clear, can be painful. It can cause harm even. It doesn't, like for Billy or for Raygun, I don't know them, but I feel badly for them because they were both embarrassed. Billy so much that he basically had to get up and just leave the conversation.
I really appreciate it, Billy. Thanks so much for interacting.
I'm sure that's painful for him. I'm sure it's painful for his followers, and I don't celebrate in his pain. So we can think of truth as something that harms us. And kind of like a machine in a factory, the temptation can be, if there's something over here that's going to cause harm, we should separate that hazard from us so that we don't get exposed to it. But with the truth, that's difficult because even though the truth can harm, the truth is also vital for us to live our lives. When we're cut off from truth, we're flying blind. The Bible talks a lot about truth, it talks a lot about fire, and there's a correlation, I think, between those two things. Now, if you're not familiar with the Bible, you probably know that we sometimes associate fire with hell. And it's true that in the Bible there are those metaphors used for hell. But fire is also used metaphorically as a symbol of purifying. There's a story in the Old Testament, it's not really a story, but just a little verse here, and it's right toward the end of the Old Testament in the book of Malachi, and it compares God to being a refiner. And let me just read the verse here. This is Malachi chapter 3, verse 3. It says, "For he is like a refiner's fire and a fuller's soap. He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver, and he will purify the descendants of Levi and refine them like gold and silver until they present offerings to the Lord in righteousness." Now here in this analogy, it's the fire of God that is purifying the descendants of Levi in this case, but I think it extends to all humanity. That there's things that are impure that need to be burned away or melted away, just like if you picture refining gold or silver, what you're doing is you're removing the impurities. Or to use a different analogy, if you picture, trees, well, to talk about the wildfires, you have trees or a vine, and there's going to be deadwood on that vine. And to purify the vine, you would cut off that which isn't producing fruit, and that's burned off. And again, that can be painful, certainly. And there is that temptation that, if these things are harsh, we want to just distance ourselves from them. And we do see that, I think, and now the jury's still out perhaps, but at least on the surface, there seems to be a lot of evidence on the surface, first look, that suggests that a lot of the authorities in California and Los Angeles, instead of making it their aim to provide proper fire suppression, to have reservoirs of water to prevent or to have access to water for firefighting, to manage forests, that there's been other priorities, things that aren't true, if you will, to the aim of managing the fire department or the waterworks and that kind of thing. And instead, because the truth is painful, they often want to substitute something else, whether that is trying to hire people instead of for their ability to lead a fire department or to fight fires or to manage reservoirs. They are instead prioritizing people that make up certain groups. They see that there's underrepresented groups, and they make it their highest aim to somehow fix as they perceive the world, and they must necessarily subordinate the aim of providing, fire suppression and water management must come separate. And what we're getting is there's a lot of dead wood that once it's exposed, it begins to burn. So for taking Billy Carson, for example, I'm not sure if he willfully didn't want to expose his ideas to the wider world, where they might be exposed to truth. I'm not sure if he set out to cloister himself, or maybe people around him didn't allow him to get exposure. Whether it's willful or unwillful, whether he's got friends abetting him or not, that's sort of beside the point. When we insulate ourselves and we don't let our ideas and our thoughts be exposed to the harsh reality of truth, we build up dead wood. And sooner or later, that dead wood is going to ignite, it's going to be painful, and we're going to get burned. I remember as a teenager, I would hang out with some of my friends at their house, and you would get some exposure to other people's parents or hockey coaches or different adults that weren't my adults, or weren't my parents rather. And I remember you sort of hear things and things that sound, oh, that's kind of interesting. And they sound kind of wise. And I can't think of a specific example, but I would hear these things that I would hear certain grown-ups say, and then I would sort of take that and I would try saying it to like my father or my mother, and very quickly they would maybe pull that argument apart quite quickly. And it would kind of suck because I thought I had some new wisdom or something, but when I exposed it to the experience of my father or my mother, I quickly saw the weakness, or that what I thought was wisdom was actually kind of dead wood. So how do we prevent ourselves from disconnecting from the truth? Social media certainly doesn't make it any easier. It makes it a lot harder, where we tend to spend a lot of time and energy with people who share our own thoughts. I certainly don't do this perfectly by any means, but I do make it a point to spend time with people in real life who have different political thoughts, who have different religious thoughts. I try to listen to podcasters and YouTubers who don't align perfectly with what I believe about the world. Now, that doesn't mean you can't. It's impossible to watch and listen to everyone. But I think a good place to start is to expose yourself to ideas that are at least a little bit different than your own, and to check your own thinking. Getting back to the analogy of dead wood, I think one of the reasons that we often resist being connected to the truth is we kind of know on some level that the truth can be dangerous, it can be harmful, it can be painful, and that it might burn away all that we are, that we might not have anything left. If we expose our ideas to the wide world, to the truth, perhaps it gets just burnt away. But I don't think that's absolutely true. I think that although the truth can be a philosophical concept, certainly, I think it goes deeper than that. As a Christian, I believe that the truth is actually a person. And although that truth can, cut, it's like a double-edged sword, it can really cut to the bone and separate, tendon from joint, as the book of Hebrews says, that it can really cut away, and that can be painful. It's a painful metaphor, and certainly having things burnt away can be painful. There's a story in the Gospel of John, chapter 15, where Jesus says that he is the vine, and that is, we are to stay connected to him. And as long as we stay connected to him, that the nutrients, the lifeblood, if you will, of the vine will flow through us and keep us healthy and hydrated, if you will, to use the analogy. When we disconnect from that truth that is the vine, then the wood dries out, it withers, and it becomes susceptible to fire, and that's painful. But Jesus also says that it's God the Father who is the gardener. And the gardener, a good gardener, doesn't want harm to come to his plants. He wants what's good for them. So he prunes not to harm, but to ultimately make healthy. Getting rid of the dead wood, getting rid of the branches, the parts of us that aren't bearing good fruit, that gets cut off, which can be painful, but ultimately what's left is something that's good, and that the nutrients from the vine can work on what is already good and make it grow even more and produce even more fruit. I feel badly for Billy Carson. I feel badly for Raygun. A lot of people are ridiculing them or have ridiculed them, and I don't celebrate that at all. But each of us, as we go through the world, we need to face the truth one way or the other, either sooner or later. And I think it's generally better to expose ourselves to truth regularly, have the bits of dead wood that build up, have those pruned away, burned off, whatever analogy you want to use. Have that done more frequently so the fires are smaller, they're less intense, less painful, and we can't go quite as far afield building up as much dead wood. If we hew closely to what is right, what is true, then we don't have that chance to get so far afield that we end up getting burned when we get exposed to the truth. I'm curious what you think. Is truth an objective thing that's out there? Is truth a person? Do we need to expose ourselves to truth? Or is it more important that we come up with better ways to insulate ourselves from that truth to prevent us from getting harmed or hurt? Let me know what you think, and thanks for watching.
That we promote and demand a work environment that is free of harassment, discrimination, and hazing.
Not only is Crowley the first woman to serve as chief, she is also the first known member of the LGBTQ+ community to hold the post.